just theory. In this episode, we speak with Amber Polk, who works as an assistant professor at University of Alabama School of Law. As a legal philosopher with a primary interest in our collective environmental crisis, Amber's research focuses on rights-based environmentalism as a legal, political, and moral movement. In this episode, we discuss Amber's views on collectivism, consumerism, and living a good life. We hope you enjoy. Hi, Amber. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, great to have you.
And we would like to start today by asking you about your career choices. What attracted you to academia and what made you stay?
Great question. So I think for me, it's probably personality more than anything. I think as a kid, I was really interested in puzzles, and I really like to learn. And so that's just what I did. And that's kind of what I have continued to do, I think, my whole life. I would say I probably, I did have a moment when I was in my undergraduate degree, where I thought about academia, but I chose not to go into a STEM-related field. So I worked for a math professor at the University of Pittsburgh as an undergraduate student, who's currently, I think, at the University of Chicago now, leading a center on computational neuroscience. So he was based in the math department at the University of Pittsburgh. And there was a pretty robust complex biological systems group between Pitt and Carnegie Mellon University, which is just down the street in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And that was a lot of fun. I mean, there were a lot of interesting people, a lot of interesting faculty. The work was interesting. It was actually some of this early modeling stuff that is now being used for these LLMs and AI and all sorts of crazy stuff that the scientists can now predict with models. I remember one of the graduate students in his lab was working on tapping into GPUs for computing power at the time. So this is now very popular. I mean, it's a popular thing to do. And that was like a novel thing. But, it was an interesting experience because the work that I did for him in his lab, it just felt very narrow. And it was one of those things where I would get emails from him like at 11 p.m. on Saturday nights. And I was just thinking to myself, like, do I really want to be, like an applied math professor where you're just working on these really narrow pieces? You just got to kind of churn this stuff out and you working all the time. That's a separate point. But so I didn't take that opportunity. And I actually worked with people at the time he had a graduate student who's an assistant professor at Columbia. He had an undergrad at the time I was there who is at NYU in neuroscience and computational neuroscience. So, I mean, he had good taste in researchers, and he facilitated, I think, a really excellent lab. But it was just one of those things where I didn't feel, there wasn't enough autonomy, I don't think, for me. I think for how my personality is in the projects I want to pursue, how I want to pursue them, the pace I want to pursue them at. I don't think that was conducive for me. So I just applied to law school out of the blue, and I didn't even think about the academy after I, did that. I was kind of like, that's one way to go. And then I go to law school, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I don't think I want to be a lawyer. And then I happened to have Heidi Hurd at the University of Illinois, who's my criminal law professor. And she encouraged me to switch into the JD PhD program. So I finished up my first year of law school, did 2 years of coursework in the PhD in philosophy, went back to law school, finished the dissertation. And so it was probably like that juncture, meeting Heidi and Michael, and kind of they integrated me into some of like the scholarly life of legal philosophy and legal academia, that I thought to myself, I'm like, this is something I could do. Like, this is something that I could choose some puzzles the law is always relevant in a very important way. You're not just screaming to the ether of some very minor tweak to a model that needs to be published, and you just got to grind it out with your 7 authors. People who do that, they have, they're just they're a different breed than I am. Law faculty get to play with more at one time, which is really fun. And especially being trained across disciplines, it gives you a skill set that allows you to pull from different areas. And that's, not all scholarship is like that. Some scholarship, it's good that it's not like that. But the people who do that kind of work, I think, are important, because there's so much work that's done that's just written for a very small audience, and as important as it can be to that audience, the ivory tower is lonely at the end of the day. And it also is, there's a sense of, some academics find deep fulfillment just in their own adventure. I think there's a sense in which I want that adventure to be shared with others too. And the law gives you a great hook for that. And of course, philosophy is its own discipline. It's its own profession, but it also has its own nature, I think, independent of the profession. And so, I guess that's how I kind of ended up in academia. It's certainly a long road, with a lot of uncertainty. And it's not that other trajectories don't have uncertainty, but I think it's a different type of uncertainty, and it's uncertainty you can't anticipate, which is also, it's like a meta uncertainty almost. It's very hard to anticipate how your life is going to be, disrupted, where it's going to land. Like it's very hard to plan things. So that's certainly one of the harder things I think about being an academic more generally, but students are great. And I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to feel the students never age, only you do. I can't even get Downton Abbey to resonate with my 1L students. They have no idea. I was like, that's like not even 10 years old, but so yeah.
Amazing. I'm not sure if I'm thinking the same thing as Aleksandra does, but it was interesting that you started with the very early formative moment or interest in your life, that as a child you were always interested in resolving puzzles. Our previous guest also went all the way back to her childhood, and her interest in collecting and ordering things and items and doing her research, meaning, and that passion kind of translating into her research career. I chipped in my 2 coins as well, explaining how me and my twin sister had a very strong sense of justice, with drawing a line in the middle of our desk, and no one should cross that line. And that sense of justice kind of continued to inspire me in my later interests with normative purposes that inform the law and what constitutes just or unjust responses.
So are we suggesting that there is a genetic component to all academics?
I don't.
You were kind of born this way.
I'm far from making any essentialist claims, but it's quite interesting that a lot of there are early formative moments in our lives that later on transpire whom we become, and those interests are actually holding strong across many years. So I thought, I'm not sure if this is also something that Aleksandra you've spotted with the conversation we had last time, and more specifically about your career path. Of course, we had a great pleasure and honored to read your recent work and recent chapter, which focuses on environmental law. So I just wanted to ask if you could expand a little bit on that interest. Where did the interest in environmental law came from?
Yeah, so this I think this should tie in a little bit to the career trajectory. So one of the things that I've definitely reflected on in my life is I've always come, so many people you come across just in life, they say at 12, 15, 19, 24, I want to do this, I want to do this, and they go and do it, and they never like think twice. Right? I was never like that. And coming to environmental law is actually exactly the same way. Originally I was going to write on something around like free will and responsibility, because there's the puzzles are super fun in the free will debate. But then one semester I was in grad school, I read, I think, Robert Kane's book on free will. And I was reading and I was like, oh yeah, I understand every page of this dense philosophy book. It feels so good. And then I got to the end and I shut the back and I was like, I have nothing to say. And, this is a very unusual position to be in for someone who ends up being a law professor. And so that was at the time when Heidi was teaching, she taught environmental law while I was in law school, and she taught a course in environmental ethics as well. And I ended up taking these courses with her. And so it was about the time that I independently came across, like there's some documentaries in the early 2010s, late 2000s, or the OOs we call them, about food production. And so I came across those independently with taking these courses with Heidi. And it just kind of dawned on me that this is by far the most important thing that humanity will ever deal with. Like it just is. Because if we don't deal with it, the regression is chaotically unpredictable. I mean, it's literally, you have no idea how like humans as a species will regress with a planet that is tropical up until like, Iceland. Like who knows? Like we have no idea what's going to happen with that. And so I was like, there's probably a lot to be said here. And so I start down the road of being curious about the environmental rights people, right? There are people that claim that there are rights to clean environments, right? Right to clean water, right to stable climate. And, interestingly enough, the environmental ethics literature in the philosophy, like the formally professional philosophy side of things, is not overly rights-based in their language, but the politics is very rights-based in their language. So I become curious about this. And as it turns out, that was not a particularly fruitful line of inquiry, at least not for a dissertation topic, because you have to be tailored, you have to be trackable, you have to be able to say something, get through some literature, and not be totally trying to understand people that don't talk to one another and don't really naturally come together and the like. So I ended up backpedaling to the animal rights folks. Why? Because that is very well theorized in philosophy. And so while environmental rights are not particularly well theorized philosophically, despite all the biocentric environmental ethics literature, environmental rights is very tightly, I think, theorized, more like moral philosophically. And so I spent my dissertation kind of focusing on animal rights and combining that with, the analytical jurisprudence of Hofeld and just in particular, the structure of rights, which I think has been deeply underplayed in contemporary legal scholarship. I mean, there's so much. It's almost like Raz and Hart and Dworkin didn't live for some of the contemporary legal scholars in the U.S. or Rawls for that matter, because they puzzle on these rights claims that I just think to myself, I'm like, I thought Rawls solved that. Does Rawls not solve this? Like, why are we still talking about this? Like, if Rawls isn't good enough, nothing you say will be good enough. Trust me, right? And so that's a whole nother side of it. But so yes, that's kind of what I focused on around my dissertation. It's a tractable project. Is interesting in the sense of I have a very hard time actually engaging with a lot of scholars who appeal to rights without themselves having any understanding of their own theory of rights, because it's very hard, I think, to have conversations about what they're talking about, right? They're pointing to, oh, things we don't like in the world, so we'll just slap a right on it and that'll fix it. And it's like, that's not how it works. Rights actually have a structure. They have normative grounding that is pretty significant in certain situations, and it may or may not be appropriate to say something like, you have a right to a clean and healthy environment. I mean, against whom? What do they have to do? Right? I mean, these are just very simple questions. Last I checked, nature owes me nothing, right? Humanity has taken everything we have from nature by force and by cleverness. We live and die by nature. I mean, when you have a right to a clean environment, it's like saying I have a right that an asteroid not hit planet Earth. I mean, there is no such thing. An asteroid either hits or doesn't hit planet Earth, and hopefully it doesn't while I'm alive. Although maybe that would help. It would probably cool the planet rapidly and buy us some time, but on climate change. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I kind of sit in terms of my research, but I kind of enjoy dabbling. Environmental law is one of the best areas for someone who wants to write like broadly about a lot of different things, because there's so much that can be written in environmental. I mean, the personalities that it attracts, number one, tend to be very collaborative and collegial, but I think it's also driven by the fact that there could not be enough people to write in this area. There's so much that could be written at any time, that collegiality, I do think, comes from not stepping on each other's toes. Unlike other areas in the US legal academy that can be a little more contentious, constitutional law is a big one. I mean, you got to have some thick skin to go toe to toe in con law with some of the the punchiest con law scholars. I think crim law is also, it can be a hard area to write in. There's a lot of important work being done, say, in crim law, but people arguing for like prison abolition now are like a dime a dozen. So where is the novel contribution? Where are you adding something important? Whether or not the world accepts it as important now, right? You want to at least feel like when you're writing that you're putting something out there that isn't just, I'm another person on the bandwagon, right? And so environmental law, there's just there's so little overlap, I have to admit, because I hang out on Zoom with a bunch of environmental law professors during the school year, and we share works in progress, and there's just so many problems.
I guess some meta structures which you've deployed in the environmental law context, or in the context of your research, like Hochfeld's analysis of rights and that bilateral structure of rights and duties, can be utilized in various contexts. I've explored it in the context of medical law, and why and who is on whom there is a duty to provide positive advantage in medical context, or is there a right to medical care? So it's a similar It's a similar problem, I guess, that allows us to apply those universal structures. And I also am with you with Hochfeld, so to say, on Hochfeld, that this is incredibly insightful analysis that can be used in various contexts. But speaking of duties, I guess your paper and your chapter does touch upon this one of those these aspects where does the duty or obligation on individuals come from to protect environment and to prevent global warming. I don't want to jump in here, but if you can tell us more about the chapter and the contribution that you've shared with us.
Yeah, so see, this is what happens when you talk to a young academic. I don't have my system of, oughts, reasons, duties, and obligations figured out yet. And so I kind of slide between them. I do think there are reasons that are not necessarily obligations. And so, perhaps in the environmental context, something like this chapter could fall into that category, but I'll back up a little bit. So this chapter came out of a roundtable symposium that I was a part of a couple of summers ago. The theme was consumption, the good life, and the Anthropocene. Okay, so naturally I get invited to this. I was like, great, yes, you're going to bring the philosopher. That's what you need to do to the symposium. And while we're talking, it becomes clear that as law faculty, we're talking really like two different conversations. There's the policy level, the global energy transition, just transition. How are we going to feed 10 billion people? How are we going to deal with climate migration? And then you have the but we like steak for dinner, right? And so you have this conversation and you're just thinking to yourself, this is a problem. I'm not sure that we're really appreciating how big of a problem it is, or if as policymakers rather than as individuals, we're thinking, well, we can have everything. We just have to have the right technology. I have no idea if that's true. This is one of the things I've thought about. I don't know if anybody's even attempted to do that type of what if, that if we just technologied enough, we would be totally sustainable at the exact same levels of, you can have all this meat. If you want to have this much meat, you can have this much soda, right? You can have this many vacations. I have no idea if our consumption at this collective level is truly something we can just technology our way out. Doesn't mean we don't try. And that's obviously what we are doing, at least to a certain degree. But so this disconnect then, right? It felt like there were two conversations, right? There was this conversation at the policy level of how do we deal with these big consumption problems. And then there was this individual, level, maybe you shouldn't have children. Right? Children are if you're going to make one choice to reduce your carbon emissions, having one less child is by far the biggest carbon emission savings you can make on your lifetime, ticket. But that gets people worked up very quickly. You start telling people you shouldn't have kids if you care about the environment. You'll see you've made enemies of everybody. Right? This is not a right, left, third party. You will make enemies of everybody if you start saying that actually might be something to seriously consider. So this kind of what I call a disconnect between the collective and the individual, kind of this collective condemnation of consumption, but then the individual, no worries, no cares as we go about our high carbon lifestyles. I was just kind of curious about why there is such a disconnect here. you would think that if we truly believe what we were saying at the collective level, that it would somehow translate or filter down at least a little bit individually, but it really doesn't. And this is speaking to like me and my peers, right? To people who live affluent lifestyles in the developed world, in developed countries. I'm not talking about really like the subsistence farmers in developing countries. I'm really like, this is very much aimed at the people who are screaming at the top of their lungs that we've got to do all this stuff to save the planet, who then personally don't do anything, right? Or whatever they do, it's so minimal, it doesn't matter. It's not like they don't have a child. It's not like they don't travel to conferences. It's not like they don't go on vacation. It's not like they walk to work. It's not like they downsize their house. It's not like they live without air conditioning, right? They still keep like all the modern enjoyments of, contemporary life. So what do I think drives this disconnect? So I actually think it's probably twofold. I think there's an issue in terms of the motivational question, like why we don't think that the Anthropocene, calling our global ecological crises the Anthropocene, like why doesn't that make us feel like we should do something different? Like we shouldn't go out to eat today. We shouldn't go to hike because we have to drive the car. We should just walk around the neighborhood. Like, why doesn't that make us feel like we should act differently? And then I think the normative problem, which is also partly motivational, but I'm not confident we actually have really good individual reasons to change what we do. We especially don't have an individual reason to change what we do personally based on the reasons that we condemn things collectively, which I think is a very important like group individual dynamic, which this is just kind of like the first pass at it. But I suspect that this comes up in other contexts. And so thinking about the motivational question, I think part of the problem that we see between kind of the condemnation of our collective consumption practices and the call to urgency to, get to renewables, reduce consumption, meatless Mondays, all that kind of stuff. I think part of the problem we have in the motivational sphere is just not really bad enough. It's bad, right? It's definitely bad. And it's bad, especially for people who've lived through like significant natural disasters, but somehow that collective badness is not like really bad enough for enough people that all of a sudden we're thinking like we have to change things. We have to change what we do. I feel motivated to change what I do, right? And I think this is a normal part of human psychology at the very least you don't like most people don't intentionally put their hands on the hot stove top. Most people don't self-flagellate. Normally, most people don't go out of their way to just like make a Girl Scout feel bad about selling cookies today, right? Like most people look at the world and they're like, I have like lots of reasons to do lots of things. If the world is better if I do this one thing, then maybe that's just what I'll do, right? I think that's just kind of a normal thing that human beings do. And I'm not confident that we are sure that this environment is bad enough to make us motivated, which is, I think, troubling. But I also think it's also, I think, a piece of like intellectual honesty, because there's no doubt that eventually things are going to fall apart quite rapidly. That's true, but that's not the same thing as living through stuff actually falling apart right now so severely that you're like, yeah, no, I shouldn't be driving into the office. I should not be flying to see my parents in a few weeks, right? We're not quite there yet. We will get there. And then on the normative side of things, so I think this is actually probably the bigger problem and the more important problem. because it has implications for climate lawsuits, like climate liability, legal liability. So I think when we deal with whether or not I should forego something that would make my life better, right? That I would enjoy, that would give me meaning and fulfillment, and would be, you know, like one of those things that I would talk to my grandkids about, right? All of that stuff requires unsustainable consumption. So when I'm thinking about whether or not I should forego doing stuff like that, if we look at an instrumental reason for foregoing that as something along the lines of, well, I'm not going to do that because it will, you know, save the planet, or because I don't want to cause climate change. I actually think that's not a reason for an individual, because individual contributions to climate change and ecological degradation are so small that they're irrelevant. And once they're irrelevant, we don't have conceptual machinery to make them relevant. And this is like a well-known phenomenon in the theory of causation, but it's talked about mostly in the context of temporal causes. It's talked about mostly in cutting off the causal chain going back in time. So of course, Caesar crossing the Rubicon is the reason we're sitting here today, but we don't treat Caesar crossing the Rubicon as kind of responsible for me sitting here today, right? It's not like he had a reason to cross the Rubicon because I was going to sit here today, right? And so this idea of the de minimis cause that's so far removed that we don't really attribute it responsibility for an outcome, I think comes up in these very large group scenarios and these very large collective effect scenarios. And that is a very significant conceptual problem. I think it's something that the economists in the tragedy of the commons scenario don't either recognize or appreciate. You know, they're talking a lot, you know, I mean, the original tragedy of the commons, I think, was like a couple of farmers, right? I mean, naturally, in a society of like 10 people, we have some amount of intuition that we can attribute causation and responsibility proportionally to how much, you know, pollution each party puts into the whole, and that's the total pollution. But when you start getting groups that are trillions, right, of individual actions and decisions, probably many more than that, because we're 7 billion right now. It's just no single choice makes any difference. And that is a very significant problem. I think that's probably by far the most significant issue in environmental policy that nobody talks about. Everybody just wants to like point fingers at the oil majors and DuPont. Actually, the polluter, DuPont, we'll call them that, right? Because they have polluted the planet. But nobody really realizes that individual choices are also necessary. And there's not a good way to divvy any of this up. I mean, some of the literature on this is kind of interesting in the philosophical literature. I think Walterson and Armstrong is the one who's most vehemently defended that we have no obligation not to joy guzzle on a Sunday morning, but we do have like imperfect duties to vote to be prohibited from joy guzzling on a Sunday morning. So right, this view needs like some work, because there's clearly some deep psychological tension. Like, why would you have any sort of obligation to, you know, vote in a legislature who's going to prohibit you from doing something that's currently permissible is a very strange thing, actually, in moral philosophy. That's kind of a very strange thing, I think. There are some who defend that we do have obligations not to, say, joy guzzle on a Sunday morning, because there's a chance that joy guzzle will precipitate catastrophic climate change like that. So these are the people who think that there is some threshold, and some number of actions around the threshold, or I guess you can expect to be potentially the threshold contributor, and so you shouldn't do it. I'm not particularly sold on that. I'm not so sure that climate change is actually a threshold phenomenon even. And I'm not sure the scientists think it's a threshold phenomenon. I think they model as well as they can, and even their models, it's difficult because of the way different climate features interact, right? So it's not just the temperature of the ocean, but also how much ice there is, the albedo of the planet, and how powerful the sun is. We know that the sun has lost and gained intensity at different geological periods in Earth's history. So it's not, we can't really tie like parts per million of carbon dioxide that closely to like the precipitation of catastrophic climate change.
Mm-hmm. If I can just interject, because I feel like there's so many rich faults there that we should probably start break them down a little. But the one thing that came to mind instantly is we think about, or at least the way that you're thinking about this prompted me to individual action versus collective action, prompted me to think about how we think about corporations in the context of climate change, because that fundamentally is also like sum of individual actions. It's not that the corporation suddenly acquires its own identity and makes a decision X, Y, Z. It is effectively a bunch of people making small individual choices that are very, in terms of accountability and responsibility, they can be very distributed and fragmented. But I feel like that also points to the same paradox that you've highlighted just now and you highlight in your paper. And I wonder how you think about it. Because that is still a more controlled group than a population. And I don't know if, I'm not going to say that, the size necessarily matters in this context. But for example, the parallels that we could also draw is people know that smoking is bad for your health. There is a lot of existing scientific evidence that smoking is bad. Anecdotally, I still know people who will smoke even for lung cancer. And there is literally nothing that you can do or I can do or the world can do to stop them. And it's similar with, corporations. Corporations can make people working in corporate environments for companies that have impact on the climate may make decisions that are better or worse for them personally in terms of their own individual outcomes. But none of those individual decisions is actually contributing to, or it is contributing, but it's not contributing. The causation, as you described it, is like quite remote. And I wonder what kind of lessons we could draw from that.
Yeah, so this is actually, I think, an important point that this paper is really focused on the individual personally. Individuals professionally or in roles, we can just say more generally in roles rather than just kind of being in their personal lives, right? And you could have a role as a husband or a mother, right? And sibling, right? Those are also roles, but I mean professional roles. So like your job title, or if you're an activist leading a group, right? That's also, I would say, more towards a professional role than a personal role. So when we're dealing with corporations, I think one of the important things to think about is, one, whether or not we can get a small enough group that we can attribute enough of the collective effects to a small enough group that we're in this kind of situation of, well, there were 4 factories around the lake. They all put in, 75 tons of chemicals, 100 tons of chemicals killed all the fish. So who's responsible for killing all the fish? Well, all the factories, right? I think we can do that. We have done that. The law has done that. So can we do that with certain types of ecological problems? So climate change would be one. We'd be looking really at the oil majors. I think that, and this is where the scientists can really help us out, because they're the ones who can quantify who and how much and the total, right? And so we can get at least close to do we have like a collective effect that we have a small enough number of people that we can point to? There is the additional problem that the oil majors don't just put products into the ether. Individuals have to use them for them to actually result in, right, increased greenhouse gas emissions. That is a problem that I have to think about. I have to think about much more deeply. I have not thought about that problem. Like, can we, maintain responsibility on the oil, for example, on the oil majors for climate change, despite the fact that the other side of the coin, right, there's a coin here that had to be sent into the ether. One side is the mining and production, the other side is the using, right? And the companies only did one side. So can we really put all of the responsibility on them and not on the consuming side, which is all the individuals? So I think there's at least a chance there. Inside of the corporation, so like responsibility inside of the corporation, I don't have a lot of issue shielding kind of lower level employees for corporate behavior. But I actually think that one of the biggest mistakes and one of the biggest failures of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has been the failure to rein in the corporatocracy of the globe. And this is basically allowing corporations to run amok with no responsibility, right? That's basically, they're more powerful than heads of states, okay? It's just a fact. There's a bunch of corporations that are powerful than more powerful than most countries in the world. And this is a huge, huge issue. And so part of me thinks that if you want to run like that, you really should take the leaders of these businesses and you should treat them like the kings of old. That is, if they don't show responsibility to the people that they wield enormous power over, they get thrown out, right? That's like you don't survive, right? The king, the king and queen who said, "Let them eat cake," don't live very long, right? So even inside of like monarchical systems, like kings always understood that they had to play down the ladder, right? You don't want insurrections. You don't want instability in your populace. And the modern corporate governance system, like global governance system, these corporations have no concern whatsoever about that. They don't care. And that is probably something that is unique, I would say, to this period of human history. So I think the best way to get individual responsibility for ecological issues is to aim for the power players, right? The global power players whose individual decisions actually do matter. And so you got to go inside of the top of corporate hierarchies, but you also have to go inside governments, right? You have to start at least with heads of state, but you probably have to go into legislatures. They wield enormous power, right? And if they don't wield it well, that's an individual problem. There should not be some sort of shielding just because it's a professional role, even though generally speaking, as we get down, and again, this is more vagueness, where's the line? As we get down the ladder to, the person who checks out your groceries, like I'm not like whatever they do professionally doesn't matter in the same way, right? So it doesn't seem to me appropriate to reach any sort of personal responsibility through that professional role, but it's part of, as you move up in the world and you become more powerful and you command more, right, authority, and you can do more, there should be more responsibility. And you shouldn't just be able to hide behind, well, that's what I did at work. Like, you can't touch my personal life. Maybe people would behave better at work if it mattered more to their personal life what they decided to do. Especially people in these very significant positions of authority.
If we could briefly return to that personal dimension, which I suppose maps on your early interest and early disposition for puzzle solving, and obviously the heap paradox, which you explore in your paper. I would be interested in kind of perhaps explaining for the benefit of our audiences what the paradox is all about. And then I have a question about it as well, because I think it boils down to this personal responsibility or perhaps motivation, not necessarily an obligation. Again, an interesting question in itself, because at the beginning of the conversation, you said perhaps we are not talking here about duties as such, rather motivation. So that in itself is very interesting. But just to kind of briefly explain the paradox, what is the paradox all about, and how does it map on those individual motivations or potentially obligations?
Yeah, so just the paradox briefly, the Sorites paradox is pretty pretty famous from antiquity. It's the question of, well, how many grains of sand make a heap? And I think what I had written here was 100 billion, but I'm not confident. I'm actually going to weigh out some grains of sand. I have some at home that I trekked from the shore a few months ago. So and then I'll do my own math to get however many grains of sand I need for a big pile. But so the problem with the Sorites, with a Sorites sequence, we can call it, is we have a discrete number of steps between endpoints, right? And the endpoints are usually in opposition, but they don't have to be. So we can have something like heap and not a heap. These are opposite endpoints. But we can also have things like young, middle-aged, and old. And between young and middle age, you can have a Sorites sequence. Between middle-aged and old, you can have a Sorites sequence. So it doesn't have to be strictly opposite, but it often is. And so going back to the grains of sand making a heap example, nobody thinks that one grain of sand is a heap. Nobody. Find someone who wants to die on that hill, because I will cite them in this book chapter. But nobody thinks one grain of sand is a heap. At the same time, nobody thinks that one grain of sand takes, however many grains of sand you have, and takes it from not a heap to a heap. So if I have a bunch of sand and it looks like a heap, it doesn't matter if I remove one grain or if I add one grain, we think it's a heap. And so what this intuition is I call it the step rule, but it can also be called like the inductive premise. It's this idea that if the concept applies at a given step n, just moving to n+1, the concept still applies, right? So this is kind of the conditional form of the step rule. And so you end up with the paradox, which says, we know that one grain of sand is not a heap. We know that 100 billion is some amount of a heap. We don't know how big, I'm not quite sure how big of a heap. The internet is not in agreement on how big of a heap a billion grains of sand is. But yet we don't have any single step where we have moved from not a heap to a heap. And so how does this apply in the motivational problem? So I think this applies in this move between treating like 350 parts per million carbon dioxide as like an ideal or an acceptable global ecology. And then somehow I think the politics around environmental policy has kind of co-opted some of the changes caused by humanity, which is very clear that human beings have caused a lot of ecological changes in the last 75 years alone. But we've been causing ecological changes for millennia, but these are really big ones. And now we're at 421 parts per million carbon dioxide. And so there's a sense in which like that political discourse seems to imply, right, or that we're somehow in an unacceptable or right, a not good global ecology. And I think, if you start thinking about what you're actually trying to say, okay, so we liked the Holocene, we liked 350 parts per million, it's nice and stable, it was temperate, yeah, it was cold in the north in the winters, but we didn't, it was temperate, a little further south in the summers, less temperate now than 25 years ago. There is certainly some endpoint that we can agree on that human beings are not going to be able to survive in. If you're saying it's 420 parts per million, that seems to me not true. There are some people who perhaps might argue this, but it does not seem to me obvious that 420 parts per million carbon dioxide is an unacceptable global ecology. And so what that does is it puts us inside of this Soriety sequence of like, how do we know when we've moved in terms of climate from something that's acceptable to something that's unacceptable for human beings? And the answer is it's probably not really knowable because it's vague, right? Wherever that line is, people will disagree and they will disagree reasonably about it. And there's going to be a period of living through indeterminacy, right? There's going to be a period where, yeah, I mean, it's not the Holocene, but also it's not that bad yet. And I think this is, you know, when we're talking about what can motivate people to change, if things are really bad, you know, a lot of times people will be motivated to change. There are psychological reasons why people won't. But, you know, if people don't think it's that bad, that's like step one, right? You know, to make a change, you have to believe that there's a problem, right? This is like recovery 101, right? To make a change, like someone has to believe there's a problem. And so if you can't do that right now because you're in an indeterminate window between what would be okay and not okay, that I think is troubling. And I actually think it's even more troubling that there's normalization that occurs with the new generation. You know, like kids grow up and they're like, they're not going to expect White Christmas. You know, it's just going to be a song. And so it won't appear to them to be problematic. And this is, I think, also a very deep problem that's just not well appreciated.
So I guess in terms of motivation, we can think of all of us individually as necessary but not sufficient conditions for contributing to global warming, for example. And I suppose motivationally, it is not dissimilar to what was going on during the COVID pandemic. How do we motivate everyone to comply with the restrictions? And some individuals being privileged to somehow breach the restrictions and benefit from that, and others not necessarily.
I may place a veto on a COVID pandemic because I'm getting flashbacks, and I would let's all just pretend this entire pandemic just never happened, and we can live our lives in peace.
No, but the paper made me think about that. How are we motivated to comply with the restrictions and deny ourselves other goods and benefits of life? A similar problem appears in this context. And examining the pandemic, I thought much of this was actually based on counterfactuals, in a way that why should I give up on my benefit if someone else will not? So much of our motivation was almost negative in that pandemic. So we would need to know that enough people would give up on some sort of privilege in order to accept that we are also not going to fly to reduce the carbon emission, or that we are not going to drive to work, only if enough people will do the same. So there was almost like counterfactual motivation in why we actually complied with the COVID restrictions. So it made me also think about the possible solution, because in your paper you indicate, well, this problem is inherently vague. So this is a matter of vagueness that we might not be able to address and give a satisfactory answer to. So I came up with one answer. I don't know if it is completely imagined, so could be wrong, but I wondered what do you think about it? So I wondered if we could look into the possible worlds analysis and Carnap's proposal. When faced with the difficult problems of causation like this, because this is really, how can one individual, when do we how do we draw the line? So I thought Carnap suggests quite an interesting solution to this, because he says, if, so to say, we can imagine a possible world where majority of people decide not to drive to work, and another possible world where majority of people do not decide to drive. No, I got completely confused. So possible world where everyone's driving to work, and possible world where everyone collectively decide not to. So it will depend which of those two scenarios will be more likely in possible worlds to persuade us to act as others do. And I wonder if this is the place where the law plays a special role in making some possible worlds more likely and making us more motivated to comply with non-driving to work. So again, this is just something I thought of when going to join this interview. Would that be a possible solution? So instead of settling on vagueness and saying, "Oh, this is simply inherently difficult and we can never address this," perhaps if we think about possible worlds and the way in which the law makes majority act in a certain way more motivational for others to join in, and others to perhaps condemn behavior which is different, perhaps that will be enough motivation for us to act accordingly. But then this is no longer pure motivation. This is now legal obligation kicking in. And it's not really a perfect solution, but I was just thinking, is there anything we can do? Are we left with vagueness?
Yeah, so COVID is an interesting example. I know there was a veto, but it is an interesting example. I'm not so sure COVID. I'm not so sure people. I think people were very split on their motivation, and I think the fact that there's strong personal reasons to not interact with people because you just don't want to get sick. I hate getting sick. I had a student make me sick like 2 years ago. He literally came up to me at the end of class. He's like, "Sorry, I was out on Friday," and coughing in my face. And once you know, I was sick for 2 weeks starting on Thursday, right after that interaction. I was like, "Why did you come to class?" I think that it's going to be very hard to tease out whether or not people followed the COVID restrictions because they were trying to prevent excess deaths in New York, living in California, or if they complied because they were scared that they were going to die from COVID or that their family members were going to die from COVID. I think it's hard to pull that apart. And there is a sense in which that student wronged me by coming into my face, spewing his virus into my mouth, right? There is a sense in which that is a wrong, which I don't think applies in the case of consumption. At least I've not seen a very convincing argument that consuming Earth's resources for human happiness is like inherently wrong. I think it's really only instrumentally wrong. I think if we had some celestial being come down, give us the technology, we could do everything, and we would stop degrading the planet because it would just poof all the problems away, right, that our consumption causes. I don't think there would be anybody who says we have to change our consumption patterns. There might be some people who are more, on the aesthetic side, or on the aesthetics. What is it? Asceticism? That's the word. The asceticism, right? Who are ascetics. They would probably say stop consuming, right? But you'll always have those people, right? Like you're always going to have like the fanatical religious people who you shouldn't have chocolate and like you shouldn't relax.
Just to quickly intersect.
And then the Carnap solution.
Yeah. I just wanted to clarify that the aspect of COVID, which I thought was interesting here, was because a lot of people complied because they knew others deny themselves the benefit of going and visiting their friends. So when a member of government suddenly goes there and does it, and how is that possible? So there was this counterfactual motivation. I would deny myself that benefit if others would also do that. So this is just the only motivation which I was interested in kind of drawing analogy with here in this, because environmental law in that sense, or environment.
I think COVID, I mean, you just need a lot, right? Like you're afraid of getting sick, you don't want to kill people, and then everybody else is doing it. Like that's a lot to motivate somebody to participate. There is a sense, I think, in which COVID perhaps is an example of groupness, of actually feeling groupness at the large scale of like the planet, which maybe is the only time that that's ever been done. Because there's certainly something to be said about like small groups. You can ascribe responsibility. People don't like, we don't have conceptual problems. People feel purpose. They feel like they get something on the benefit side too when they participate in the group, just like they feel like they're causing problems when they create costs for the group, right? There is something in small groups that like becomes salient for individuals. And maybe COVID is like the one example of that happening in a large group, because I think at very large groups that stuff just like falls away. I was literally having a conversation with my colleagues yesterday at lunch about this in terms of the corporate profit motive. And one of my colleagues said, well, small businesses, during COVID, they chose to like not make a profit and to stay loyal to employees. And that's just what they chose to do. And there was no long-term, it was not a long-term profit strategy. It was not a short-term profit strategy. It was a profit non-maximization strategy. It was loyalty first. And I mentioned, I was like, see, like we work in small groups. Like a lot of things work in small groups. There's somehow stuff falls apart between the small and the very large group because large corporations are like psychopaths. They operate like psychopaths. But the CARNAP, okay, so the CARNAP solution. So see, this is why I didn't write on free will. Because I don't like the possible world solution. Because I think it's a question that doesn't really have any meaning. Like how, right? Because the free will solution is, with possible worlds is, could I have done otherwise? Well, how close is the possible world that you do otherwise to the present world? And if it's very close, you could have done otherwise. If it's very far away, you couldn't have done otherwise. So the example, I think, if I can recall this, is something like the track athlete who shows up on Saturday morning to run the 100 meters and he comes in third and he's like, darn, could I have done otherwise, right? Could I have won that race? And the way we evaluate this is we look at the possible worlds. Well, what did he actually do? Well, he went out the night before and he was partying and he was hungover, right? And so what are the possible worlds? He could have had a good night's sleep the night before and just not partied, right? He could have partied but went home early. He could have trained harder, right? And you can just come up with all these different scenarios of what he could have done differently. And you look to see like whether or not which possible world is close, like any of those are close to the actual world. And if they're close, you say he could have done otherwise. And so it was within his will to do otherwise. I just don't think it's a very good intuition. For me, it's not a strong intuition, right? All possible worlds are equally as far from the actual world in that they're not the actual world. And it's very hard to evaluate, I think. I wouldn't quite go so far as it's like a meaningless question, a la Wittgenstein. But I think it's very hard to like evaluate closeness of possible worlds. I just, there's like a sense in which you either have that intuition or you don't. But I like the idea. I certainly like the idea.
And maybe here is a good good point to stop. What a fascinating conversation, Amber. Thank you so much for joining us. A really rich topic, and I think we could be speaking for another 3 hours or 10 hours and probably would not exhaust it. But thank you so very much. Emilia, I don't know if you have anything else that you'd like to add.
No, just thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Amber. It was great having you and discussing and teasing some aspects of your paper. It was also a great privilege to read your paper. And we've been absolutely delighted to have you today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Thank
And
you.
good luck with the rest of your series. I look forward to seeing it published, and enjoy your summers as much as you can, for sure.
Thank you.